Okay. Mayor Parker?
Here.
Mr. Stratwell?
Here.
Ms. Christie? Here. Mr. Landuse?
Here.
Mr. Leonard?
Here.
Mr. D?
Here.
Mr. Zepnick?
Here.
Mr. Travellini?
Here.
And Ms. Gutschall.
Here.
Adequate notice of this meeting of the Bedminster Township Land Use Board was filed with the Township Clerk and sent to the Bernardsville News and the Courier News and to all subscribers and posted in the Township Municipal Building, 1 Miller Lane, Bedminster, New Jersey, on January 12, 2018.
Please stand for the flag.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we have a little bit of business that we need to take care of. So we have our minutes from June 7th, 2018. Everyone's had an opportunity to look at those. Do I hear a motion?
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Abstain? Anybody? Minutes are approved. June 14th, those minutes, look at those. Do we have a motion?
Move to approve. Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
I will abstain.
Abstain, okay. Minutes are approved. We have two resolutions that also need to be approved. You've had a chance to look at those. We've got Malincrot, 2018-012. Do I hear a
Motion to approve.
Motion for
Second.
that?
Mayor
Okay.
Parker?
Aye.
Mr. Stratwell?
Aye.
Ms. Christie? Aye. Mr. Landuse?
Aye.
Mr. Leonard?
Aye.
Mr. D?
Aye.
Mr. Zepnick?
Aye.
Mr. Travellini?
Aye.
And Ms. Gutschall.
Aye. We also have Godloop, 2018-013. That resolution, we need a motion.
Motion. Second.
I'm sorry, who made the first?
Jeff?
And Nick, you were the second?
Second.
Mr. Stratwell?
Aye.
Ms. Christie? Aye. Mr. Landuse?
Aye.
Mr. Leonard?
Aye.
Mr. D?
Aye.
Mr. Zepnick?
Aye.
Mr. Travellini?
Aye.
And Ms. Gutschall.
Aye. This is the time that the public has an opportunity to speak about anything that's not on the agenda. Seeing no one, we will continue. Lamington Fiddler's Elbow, did we already approve that? I don't remember that for
No, that
completeness.
application has just come in, it's pending review. That's the one that has yet to be scheduled.
Okay, do you want to,
Yeah, I think we're looking at September for that because I think we have issues with quorum through August.
we always do.
So, it's a fairly simple application. I think the first meeting in August.
Or September.
I'm sorry.
September,
Yeah.
you're talking about. What is the date of that September? Do you know? I don't know either.
not meeting in August?
We are not meeting in August.
Okay.
We have no application other than this, and this is ready for September.
September 6th is our...
September 6th, good.
September 6th.
Okay, so we will have that in September.
What's the date?
September 6th, the first Thursday. Okay, we have the Affordable House Ordinance. Who's going to speak on that? Tom? Frank? Frank, okay.
At first glimpse, what you have there looks pretty daunting. These, I just figured I'd be the first one to say it. What needs to be recognized,
Everything will be a test at the end of the night.
pass, fail.
It's a rough crowd.
Yeah, really.
There are two documents that you have in front of you. One is the easy read version, and the other is compare it with what we already had version. And what this is the Affordable Housing Ordinance that provides a whole series of the requirements that the housing element calls for and that the COA regulations and the UHAG rules all call for as things you have to do to basically have a certified or a court-approved plan. So this ordinance very much looks like the one that was adopted back in 2004, I guess. No, yeah, 2004. Which is the one that you see with the crossouts and so the categories of things that are being dealt with in this ordinance are essentially the same. The model ordinance format that was used for the earlier version and the newer version is slightly changed, so there are some changes. You'll see some things that got moved to a different place, so you look at it here and it's in both versions, but in a different location. The essence of it is you're making a modest change to a whole series of affordable housing regulations that have been part of your code for 15 years. And the substance of what you need to do tonight is acknowledged for the governing body that Tom and I are representing to you that this is what the affordable housing ordinance needs to be to meet that obligation, and that it is so much like the one we had before that it doesn't take a lot of substantive review to say that looks okay because it's already our law. And it's the modest changes here are things that we ought to be able to say that looks okay. But I don't want to foreclose conversation about it. I just figured by way of introduction, I don't know that we need to go through this section by section. I'm happy to answer questions anybody might have about any section.
Well, we did sort of go through it the last time, and the bottom line is we need the 28 affordable housing apartments. That's the bottom line, isn't that right?
That's the bottom line of what our affordable housing obligation is. That's correct. And
Yeah.
the way that the program will be administered in the town, according to the town's rules, are established in this ordinance. So it says all
I
the
tried to
stuff.
read it, I really did,
Yeah.
Frank.
It's an easy read, really.
The gist of the changes from the old to the new are basically to keep us in compliance. It's not,
With current regulations.
Right.
There have been some changes in between,
Right.
new definitions, things like that, but not really substantive.
okay.
The one thing I'll call your attention to is you were referred the version, the clean version that's marked ordinance 2018-10. We have a report from the court-appointed master, which you also received a copy of along with this ordinance. And the only portion of what he's saying here, this relates to his review of what we have to do to get our judgment of compliance and repose from the court. And of the things that apply to this ordinance, the top item, draft affordable housing ordinance, has 2 bullets. And my office will insert these 2 things. One that says that half of the very low-income units will be available to families. That's one of the regulations that we don't really have a choice about. And the other relates to the way income limits are established and provided for so that people know what eligible income ranges fall into. So we will make those 2 corrections to this. The township attorney has opined that those are not substantive changes. They are very much in the vein of clarifying what this says. So those changes in this ordinance will be subject to adoption by the governing body before the August 9th, I think it is, final compliance hearing. I think August 2nd is when the governing body was going to meet on that. So what they're looking for from you tonight is a review of the ordinance in terms of its consistency or lack thereof with the master plan. And essentially, your master plan says, do affordable housing, do it like this, and write an ordinance just like this that shows you how to do it like this. So it couldn't be a whole lot more consistent with it's certainly not inconsistent with any aspect of your master plan, and that's your finding.
Okay, what do we formally need to do? Any questions on this? Any?
I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And maybe it's in here, I didn't go through the whole thing, but Frank, I know that in the past, it seems like certain low-income units maybe are occupied by people whose income has gradually
Increasing.
gone up over the years. Does this address that scenario at all with the new 28 units?
The 28 units will be rental units, and they'll be
So they're all rental?
affirmatively marketed to tenants who we shouldn't have that problem with because they'll have to qualify and requalify.
So they have to requalify to...
But the people who bought the units in the hills don't have to requalify.
Right.
Well, they don't have to requalify every year, though. Federal housing does, and it's not a problem, actually. What the way Mount Laurel works is the municipal's obligation is to provide through zoning the opportunity for the construction of housing by the private sector. And once constructed, it must be marketed, and usually there's a lottery to get the first occupants of the units. And the rents, if they're set, if it's a rental, or the sale price are set to make sure that they're under the maximum income guidelines that change over the years as median income rises, so do the income guidelines. The townships, municipalities achieve credit both by zoning, and the unit actually becomes a true credit, a unit, an affordable unit, by it being marketed and then rented to a qualified household. That's when the income restriction ends for the individual. The income restriction remains on the unit for 30 years. So if by chance a person who was moderate income grows in income, they are still eligible to live in the same unit that they originally occupied forever, for their whole life. And the township gets no debit or negativity as a result of that. That's the way it works. And that's nothing that needs to be changed for the future units, because that's nothing that is allowed to be prohibited. That's what the whole idea of Mount Laurel is, to create the realistic opportunity for the construction of those for sale or for rental units, that households whose incomes may change, but who are qualified when they enter it, meet the income guidelines. And it's expected that people will have decreases in income or increases in income. And as long as they pay their rent or pay their mortgage, they get to stay there. Now,
So I'm sorry, Tom,
can you regulate that? My answer to you would be no, you can't prohibit that. And you shouldn't, because you would not get credit for any better credit for prohibiting a person from making income than you would by just doing what the system allows.
Right.
You get nothing. Just by kicking a person out and getting a new affordable unit person in, that doesn't make another unit or another credit. It doesn't even get you another notch on the obligation. It actually has been met by that unit being, it actually is met, if you do it by zoning, by a zoning ordinance. It's then,
That provides for the unit even before it's built.
even before it's built, and it becomes a reduction in your obligation. The true, these are kind of technical terms, but it becomes a true reduction in the obligation when it's built and occupied the first time, and even if it never got occupied again for 29 years, it would still be a reduction because it would have been built. And as long as, and in the same token, as long as it is occupied initially and in the future, if there were change in tenancy by a person who's eligible, household who's eligible, it is a credit-worthy unit and a reduction in your in the municipal obligation. So I know it's complicated, but that's the way Mount Laurel works.
I'm not sure I got the answer to his question, though. If somebody moves into it 30 years ago, they unschooled, untrained, no money, all right, they're eligible
Right.
when they apply, they go in, they go to school, they get trained, they get a good job, they start making more money. As long as they stay in that residence, regardless of what happens to their income, they can stay there?
Yeah.
Yep, they're good.
So the justice...
And you got credit for that? You, if you're...
No, I'm not worried about my credit. I'm talking about the justice.
Well,
The justice
No,
of
forget
that low-income person, that unit not being available for a low-income person is not our issue. Our issue is we made them available
right.
once upon a time, and
Right,
we
and
satisfied
actually,
our...
you didn't make it available, all you did was let the private sector build it.
Build it.
Right.
But you said to the private sector, if you do this, you must do these restrictions, and that's what the restriction is. Now, and if you think otherwise, I think it's hard to imagine, but it's very unusual in New Jersey and in most modern states in real property for a person to be evicted because their income goes up, okay? It's very hard to evict anyone for anything except non-payment of rent.
Right.
And so the likelihood of a removal of a person for having a
success.
success
Success.
of making, of gaining income over their lifetime would be, I don't think it'd be enforceable. The way so it's not something to even worry about, because it doesn't in the Mount Laurel set of regulations and COA regulations, the court, even if you were just in court, it doesn't penalize the town that the person or household grows in income.
So it doesn't matter who occupies the dwelling, so long as it was made available at an affordable price to
No,
begin
well,
with?
don't think about it that way. The person who first occupies it and was qualified is allowed to continue to occupy it.
Okay.
If they try to re-rent it or resell it to someone else, those regulations kick in full force,
I see.
and those are violations if someone unscrupulously and improperly does that. And people sometimes do, but that's a violation of the deed restriction, the ordinances, and the program. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. That means they did something wrong, okay?
Right.
So in answer to George's question is, if a person is qualified when they get in, they're allowed to stay even if their income goes up. And that's a good thing, by the way, because that means that the idea is to let people have a start in housing at a place where they can work and to get a job that would
No,
perhaps
right.
grow in income.
The initial goals are good, but now the
I
person's
understand.
making a couple $100,000 a year, and they're gonna still
way it
live
works out.
for next to nothing.
That's the way it works, and another thing that'll
I mean,
bother
I
you
want
is
to,
that
but-
after the deed restrictions run out, a person can sell it for market value. The
And they
owner
are.
can sell it,
And
and
they
they are in
are
fact
right
doing
now.
that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should necessarily criticize that, although there are ways to deal with that a little bit, but why is that not something to criticize? Because technically, that's what Mount Laurel said, was have a durational requirement for its affordability, and build them well to begin with. And as you guys as architects know, real estate, residential real estate, the structure depreciates, and there is not necessarily any more income for that renter or that owner to use, to renovate.
What it does, though, is, like where Rich was going, it does prohibit the next low-income person from having that opportunity, when in fact the situation arises, when they are making a couple $100,000. I think that's what
detrimental.
we're thinking.
But that's not what Mount Laurel
Right.
is aimed
We
to
get it.
protect. There's no 100% saturation of the obligation, and it hasn't happened. It probably won't happen because the need is so high and the supply is so low that the likelihood of that really being a problem is near zero. I wouldn't worry about it. I think the focus on the things to worry about, and, the governing body has to deal with that, is if somebody violates a deed restriction and, re-rents and doesn't comply with the requirements, that's not right, and that has to be checked. And we have BHCC, and they're very careful about trying to monitor that people comply with their deed restrictions and that they
Okay, what would you like us to do?
And
Oh,
Tom,
I'm
just
sorry.
what you just said is in the ordinance.
and that's right.
So the process that you just mentioned in those last
That's
15 seconds.
That's one of the regulations
is in
that
the
we have in this ordinance.
So that there
Right.
is a rental, then it's supposed to be registered and run through BHHC, essentially to manage those assurances that it stays affordable in a rental situation.
And just to restate George's question a little bit differently, and I think you already answered this, but I just want to clarify it. You've just never heard of a situation where, with strictly a rental unit, you said nobody's gotten evicted from a rental unit because their income went up. But are there not entities in the state where the landlord is a governing body? And of course, when you have a lease,
Let me tell you about...
your lease comes due, and you have to renew, but there's never a requalification on a lease like that.
There's an exception I explained to you at the beginning, which is there are federally subsidized housing units that are low and moderate and have basically housing authority units. And even they don't kick you out because your income went up. What they do is, you start by paying only 28% of your gross monthly income to rent it. Even if your income is below the poverty level, you could move in and pay next to nothing if your income is next to nothing. As your income goes up, you have to pay 28% of your gross monthly income, including if your income becomes a windfall and you happen to be, making tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have to,
You still pay 28%?
you don't get kicked out, you have to pay more, and what do? Usually you move out because I
Get
could
something
buy
nicer, yeah.
this mansion, right? Or I could buy stuff, and why am I giving them so much of my income?
Yeah.
But that's a different system, and maybe that's been used in a parallel, but I'm telling you, to evict someone in New Jersey is
Very hard.
extremely difficult in a residential apartment, with certain exceptions, and the non-payment is the only good one. And so I wouldn't, let's put it this way. It may be a problem, but it's not viewed as a problem by the New Jersey Supreme Court or COA in terms of the constitutional obligation of the municipality.
Okay.
Right, you may think it's a problem, you may think that's not right, that's not fair, you're not helping enough people. Maybe there's some truth to that, but the Supreme Court doesn't view it as a problem. They'd rather get as many more units as you can, and unfortunately, the numbers keep saying that too, so.
The other thing is the genius planners and lawyers that brought us this stuff 35 years ago, 30 years ago. The initial intent was precisely that someone would buy into one of those units, they would be allowed to stay, and as the unit value increased at some point, they would have the opportunity to capture that equity and to move up economically, class-wise. Somewhere in the last 30 years, the tenor of the court and advocates basically said, wait a minute, why do we want to give anybody long-term use of a unit that could serve 2 or 3 families in the same period of time? So we started out with a theory that said, let them grow equity, and we ended up with a theory that said, get them out if you can.
Okay, what would you like us to do?
All you're doing today on
Yes,
this
with this
ordinance
document, yes.
it is a good thing to know about, but basically, the governing body has introduced an ordinance that is the one, the final accepted version, with anything Frank explained to you, is the version that the governing body is likely to adopt at the August 6th meeting, I think, or sometime soon. They've introduced it. That means they've said we're gonna have a hearing on this in August or whatever, and we're going to adopt this if we so decide to adopt it. Whenever a land use ordinance is done, it sounds like a little bit like ping pong, but basically, when they introduce it, they send it to you to find whether you find it consistent with the master plan, or at least not inconsistent with the master plan. You just adopted a housing element fair share plan that updates things to 2018 and says we will do things to comply with the settlement agreement that we have with the Fair Share Housing Center. And we even have Judge Miller having said to us, yes, you're on the right course, and on August 9th, I'm going to consider whether to give the township a judgment of compliance if you have adopted this type of ordinance and agree to carry out the things of the settlement. So I would say to you that you should absolutely make a motion to find it consistent with the master plan, because you just updated your master plan to be 2018, now you're doing an ordinance to be 2018. And so that, we need that to be done before the next meeting of the Township Committee. I guess you could open to the public in case there's any comments or questions, just to be transparent.
Okay, we will open it up to the public if anybody has any questions.
Could I,
Certainly.
on the letter from
Mr. Kate.
Austin Maitland,
Yes.
then all these condition 1 through 9, are they all addressed, or?
Some of them are reflecting changes that they asked for and that were already made in the housing element. A couple of them will require that we come back to you and have a hearing to amend it as a result of the compliance judgment. The compliance judgment will be conditional upon any other changes to any of our plans or ordinances that the master says are required. They don't have to be made between now and August 9th. They'll have to be made subsequent to that. So we'll be talking about this in September.
Oh, maybe not all 9, but...
Right, some of them are already covered by what was done.
Some will be addressed later.
None of them create a problem that increases the dimensions of our affordable housing obligation. It's not that sort of thing.
And by the way, that's common. You get a judgment of compliance from Superior Court, and most of the settlements, there's about 200 settlements now, and they often have conditions, and those involve implementation steps, but none of these are earth-shattering or problematic. And I guess it could happen even at the hearing. The hearing is noticed to the public. It's for August 9th. Anybody who is interested might appear at the hearing before the judge, might say, I object, or I don't think they should get married, or whatever.
Right.
And here we go with what do we like, what do we don't like, and then the judge might say, well, I agree with that person, and I'm going to put this condition. It rarely happens, could happen, not very likely, and basically then carry out the steps of the judgment of compliance. But from the day of the judgment of compliance, you have 10 years of repose for the third round obligation. And because of our numbers, we have some fairly high confidence that you're going to be good at round 2, but you'll do steps necessary before 2025 to start the process for the fourth round. So,
Okay, again, I'll open up to the public, seeing no one, okay.
so it's a motion to find the proposed ordinance that's been introduced by the council and with the changes that Frank mentioned to be consistent with the master plan. Is there such a motion?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
And a roll call, Trina, please.
Mayor Parker?
Aye?
Mr. Jacobs?
Aye.
Mr. Starkoff?
Aye.
Ms. Christie? Aye. Mr. Landuse?
Aye.
Mr. Leonard?
Aye.
Mr. D?
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik?
Aye.
Mr. Travaglini?
Aye.
Can Anna vote?
Do we have 9 without her?
We do.
We do, so she can't.
Okay. Ms. Gutschall?
Aye. Okay, motion passed.
She could vote, but doesn't count.
Doesn't
That
matter.
doesn't sound very nice, does it?
We'll get her next time.
Trina, if you would report that in an email or something to Judy to confirm that the planning board did the referral report tonight and found it to be consistent with the master plan.
Okay, Frank, we were going to talk about our re-examination again, and you want to start the conversation?
Yes, as you recall, when we adopted this back on May 10th, it was done with some haste to complete it before the deadline under the statute. I know that some of the members felt they hadn't had adequate time to review everything it said, wanted some more time to look at it and to come back and talk about it, recognizing that we can amend it at any time. The takeaway that I had from the discussion that we had back in May was that the references I had made to lost ratables should be memorialized here, and was done on page 5 in a table that was not in the earlier draft.
Right.
And what's somewhat noteworthy about that is, as you look at the master plan and the vision it has for the town's future, a vision which in the past has had a balance of economic development and conservation and environmental protection throughout most of the township. If, in fact, there is fine-tuning to be done, data like this is part of what we should be looking at to figure out what, if any, changes might be needed and where. So when I look at this table, I see a couple of things that are challenging. First one is the very bottom line, which is that the AT&T property went from 180 million to 130 million. So that was a 20% loss of value, $50 million that the taxpayers had to make up. And if you look at this other collection of offices, some in Pluckerman, some up here on 206 or in the village, there's another 11 or 12 million dollars that was net lost out of those properties. So we're talking about $60 million, and we haven't, this is not an exhaustive list. These were a sampling that we knew had some history that might have indicated this, but I think if Ed Kerwin gave us this table, it would probably be 2 pages long. The point of all that is to say, we have for the longest time benefited by being Bedminster at this location on the interstate and state highway grid, good enough to attract $180 million rateable at one point, and even more before that, I think. A desirable location that, like many other parts of the suburban office market, has found challenging times. We've been blessed by the fact that the challenges so far have been kind of minor, but it's sort of that situation where whenever you have that 800-pound gorilla who's protecting the castle, if he dies, everything dies. So while we may see the need for some tune-up in certain sectors where we may need to look at alternative uses or what we could do to support the uses that we want to retain, we also have to be prepared for major change that could occur at AT&T. We don't want to predict it, we don't want to pray for it, but we want to plan for it so that we know that as change occurs, the community has become acquainted with the range of possibilities that could be okay and have helped the governing bodies and the planning board select a way forward that if change is coming, we can buy into. So that's probably the big question that we're going to be talking about, not in this re-exam, but in the going forward part of how might the master plan need to be updated. I've heard a range of opinions from members of the board and others in the community that go from, I don't want to call them extremes, but let's say polar ends, where on the one hand, we need massive changes for the township to end up being able to sustain its rateable base, significant possible changes that we've never talked about, and on the other hand, that we have a really good master plan that hasn't hurt us yet. What's the rush to change it? And I don't think that the board members themselves really represent those polar ends, but I think that there is a spectrum across which we have to think about the baby in the bathwater scenario. So what can we do to make things better without making things worse, I think is really the objective that we're trying to talk about here. I don't have any ambition of guiding you through this document page by page. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Because this, as a re-examination report, doesn't carry the weight of being the master plan, the real changes that you make to the master plan over time are going to happen because some deliberate policy modifications are being made. And I think those are the things you're going to spend the next 6 to 9 months having serious conversations about, and then ultimately resolving to change some things. I don't know what those things are going to be yet. I think we probably need to plan forward into what those areas of exploration need to be. But in general, it's time for everybody that's had a rich office market in places like the Somerset Hills to guard it carefully and plan for what happens if things don't go the way we'd like. I think when Malincrot decided this was a great location, that was an awesome decision on their part, really smart on their part, but it didn't hurt us at all. To get a credit like that at that end of the highway where it turns to 2 lanes, not too bad. Those are the kind of properties that are typically very exposed to the vagaries of the market. So I think we're doing okay. I'm not trying to predict doom, but I think if you look at that table and you see $60 million of lost ratables, we have to think about how do we recover from that over time, and what is good stuff to do and what is maybe not what we want to do. And if you want to talk about that in a general way tonight, I think it's fine that we can do that.
I think we should. I'm going to open it up to the board to talk about it. I know, George, you might have had some issues
Well,
or
one
some
issue I
questions.
had with the master plan re-examination report, that's what we're talking about, right?
Right,
Yes.
that's the report,
Yeah,
right.
I had a
Mhm.
problem with, let me go to the page, with including this strategic economic development planning, Somerset County. I don't think that should be included in the report.
Where is that, George?
I have it on page 12, but that may be in...
Page 8, the state development one or the county
No,
one?
the county.
Page 12, with a little map.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see what bearing that has on us. I mean, if people want to look at it, read it, that's fine, but I don't think as a, you know, it should be part of it. I just don't think so.
Well, I respect your opinion on that. If you look at page 9, one of the areas of inquiry that the re-exam needs to cover are changes in state, county, and municipal policies and objectives. So that's why there were references to the state plan. The county, that's not really the county plan, but their county strategic initiative is essentially the latest plan of sorts that they've come up with. So it's not inappropriate for it to be referenced here.
I think it is. I don't think it should be in there, and that's one of the issues I have. I mean, everybody else might think it's fine. I don't think it really should have bearing on what we do.
Well, I guess what I was saying, George, is I don't think it's really discretionary. I don't think it's something where we can decide it doesn't belong in here.
Why? I mean, I'm just curious. Why?
Because it's a change in the county's planning policies that the statute directs us to ask about at the time that we do this report.
Did who ask about it?
That the state statute asks us 5 questions that we have to answer for the re-exam. I think they're listed on the first couple of pages. Yeah, on page 2. But I think the board
E?
certainly, the
Is
board...
that E on page 2?
E. No, that's for redevelopment.
Yeah, A, B, C, D, and E, right?
Right. I don't, you know what, I'm not seeing what I thought I was telling you. I apologize for that. I guess it's been such a practice to understand that we are sort of interconnected to the other tiers of government in terms of planning, even though neither the state nor the county does our planning for us, tells us how to plan. We're supposed to be all trying to work together to make sure that, I mean, the whole purpose of that county strategic initiative was to look at this emerging problem that we've seen around Somerset and Morris County and try to get a handle on what towns could do about it in order to not keep losing ratables like this.
Is it the county that's made Bedminster such a great place over the years? I mean, maybe it is, I don't know. Is it?
George, I think one of the things that I think what Frank is trying to get at is the inclusion of it in the report does not indicate any endorsement or agreement by the Township of Bedminster. It's merely one of the exterior planning documents that the township needs to recognize exists in order to develop its follow-on planning from this master plan reexamination.
Well, I think it is an endorsement by having it there. That's just, again, that's my weird perception. Yeah, I mean, I'm just telling you how.
No, well, that's
George,
fine.
can I ask you,
Yeah,
what about it that you disagree with, like?
It's not necessarily that I disagree with it, but it's just that, you know, it seems like the re-examination should be done from within the town. I mean, it's certainly, I think it makes sense to be aware of it. I mean, when the gentleman came in and talked about 24/7 over here, I mean, that's fine with the county. But I don't think people in Bedminster, well, I shouldn't speak for people in Bedminster, but me, I don't foresee 24/7 activity going on over here. Okay, and that's what he said. So it's just comments like that and that, you know, that's how I feel. I mean, I think that everything that we should, that at least the way I approach it, what's good for the residents of Bedminster?
Well, I think we all have that, George. I think everyone on this board feels that way.
I would hope so.
Yes, I mean, and I believe that. And I think, and I may be wrong, but it seems to me that we need to know what goes on within the county, just so we have a full picture. I mean, we don't stand completely alone. I mean, we're part of that county. And I think that that's what is intended here. I mean, I might be wrong, but that's how I take it.
Where did this question come up that's in that strategic section about whether to continue aggressively purchasing open space is being questioned? Maybe we should use that money for something else. I never heard that before until I read it.
I think it was a discussion at the township committee level.
Oh, the township committee brought it.
They're really the ones who decide how to spend the money.
So it's got nothing to do with this section. This,
It seems out of place.
You mean it shouldn't be where it is?
It seems out of place.
it's not a Somerset County suggestion, I guess.
It looks
No,
like
it's
it
not,
is.
you're right.
Oh, okay.
It looks like it is in this document.
Yeah, the way it's...
No, that should be under the new heading below that. I'll fix that.
Oh, okay. The
In the
septic
next
problem?
version.
Good catch. Thank you.
There is a crossing of objectives here, clearly. So, maybe our priority should be what's good for Bedminster, but certainly not to the mutual exclusion of the greater community of the county, the greater community of the state, and where that particularly intersects is when we talk about things like roads. Okay, so if the county came down to us and told us that we had to, widen 206 for another mile and a half north because of some agenda that they had, then, perhaps you're right, that we should rail against those types of initiatives or those types of instruction coming from above. But there are issues with respect to things like traffic, et cetera, that we need to be mindful that we're working in conjunction with the county and not in our little vacuum of Bedminster, because we all know there are people in Bedminster who, want us to pull up the trap door and don't let anybody in because, it's worked well for 150 years. Well, things are changing, and unless we plan for the change we want, we're going to get the change we don't want, vis-a-vis, talking to some of the old timers, the hills, who by their estimation was the worst plague that could ever been, heaped upon, the town of Bedminster. So,
With all due respect to the Hills residents, right?
Well, sometimes I've been in meetings where they didn't have any respect for the Hills residents.
Yeah, so have we.
So, the idea that there is some agenda or some goals that the county may lay out for us, particularly as they intersect things like traffic and the like, parkland, green space, what have you, I think there should be some sensitivity on our part to what the larger goals are. However, I don't think I'm not hearing that these are imperative things. We're just having to consider it. We don't have to necessarily abide by their instructions or live by their...
It's not becoming your plan in any respect.
Right.
Okay, so
Right.
in that context, I'm really okay with it. We do live in a bigger world than, the border of Far Hills and Tewksbury, what have you.
Well said, Rich. Okay. Anything else on this particular document that we,
On this document or
well,
this topic?
this topic, we're going to take the topic, I think, a little further, but the re-examination document is what, because that's what we passed, and that's...
Right, but I think, in fairness to the question, the county came here and said, we have a toolbox, we have some things you might want to think about. The town didn't say, take your toolbox and hit the pike. They said, we'll think about some of these things, and I think that's part of what our forward-looking master planning is intending to do. So it's not, so when I say we're not doing what they're telling us to do, George, we're participating in a process, and the outcome will be driven by what Bedminster chooses in that process. But they're facilitating a process that really gets at a problem that's occurred all around the county. So I think it's county leadership at a really high level that led to these steps that they've taken. And I think they're not trying to really push it on you. They're just trying to make it available so that if it can be helpful, you can... And Larry and Steve can tell you...
trying to push it on.
Well, Larry and Steve are in the best position to tell you if they feel like it's being pushed on them or not.
It's not being pushed on us. Those are tools that the county is providing, and it's up to Bedminster, the planning board, and the township committee to make decisions whether to follow those rules or not. George, I disagree with you. It is not being pushed on by the county at all. They developed a plan using outside planning professionals and engineers and other land use experts and said, hey, we identified AT&T as a priority growth investment area because of its critical nature to the town, to the roadways, to the economics of Somerset County, the number of folks that work there, the people in the county that work there, the people that come to the county who work there, or the contractors who work there and support that facility. So if that facility goes dark, that's a big old problem, not just for Bedminster, but for the county as well. So the county said, hey, if you want us to consider some planning options for that property, once again, planning, not that, geez, we hope AT&T stays.
Yeah, I'm not-
That certainly, that's great, right? That's great, but I hope they stay. I'm talking about what your objection was. The issue of including that reference was because that planning option, that tool was provided to us. The report was prepared, we can say, great, the report was prepared. And that's what Frank did by identifying it in this reexamination report. Don't like it? It's not the master plan. This is not the master plan. This is the master plan. The master plan will be developed possibly in the next 6 to 9 months. I think that's what we've always sort of been talking about as we get more into those details. We can take the recommendations, or the, not even recommendations, the ideas that the county's professionals threw out there and throw them away. Or say some of these have merit.
I will tell you, and I said it at the beginning of the year, I think I said it last year, and time is growing very short. I've got till the end of the year. But one of my goals was to make sure that we're not holding the bag should AT&T leave. There are a lot of options out there, some of which you guys took a field trip to see. You may like that, you may not like that. But we owe it to the people of Bedminster to deliberate and determine what we like, what we don't like, what we can live with, what we can't live with. And that ought to be open, and that ought to be discussed, and we would be negligent, in my opinion, to not go down that road. That doesn't mean we have to go down the road to say, you know, all comers, but we do need to have that discussion. I strongly believe. And I personally would like to see it before the end of 18 so that I can participate. But if not, I'll be in the audience and I'll be cheering you on, and I'll make a comment when I feel necessary, if it's open to the public. So,
yeah, just to be clear on my end, I think it's absolutely we need to do that.
Yeah.
I'm 100% in agreement. It's some of the other areas on the corridor that I think, I have reservations about. But
Well,
I'm in agreement.
and we need your input on what's too far. I think that's extremely important. I think we need to figure out where the guardrails are and where the brakes are and where we should put on the brakes. I think that's vitally important, because I don't want people thinking that this is just a, roll out the red carpet to any and all comers.
Paper exercise.
I think that we need to add that we're looking at the corridors, and we're not looking at anything west of 206. That is not what we have even looked at or even considered to make changes to. It's only those areas in our commercial areas and our corridors that we're looking at, from my knowledge, that so far that we've done. No?
I mean, this is the master plan. When you get into the master plan, it's not just the corridor, but it could be issues such as lot FAR, and supporting support what uses or what accessory structures can support those properties out west. So we talk about the larger master plan.
Well,
some of those elements may come back in.
But they might come back in. I don't think that that's where our.
I think what the chair,
This particular topic that we're discussing right now, we're sort of focused on the corridor, but to the extent the master plan re-examination report, one of the issues that I very much agreed with George was that we did adopt this document without additional scrutiny, and some of the comments that I discussed with Frank are not necessarily corridor driven, but on topics or policy issues
I think Carol was trying to allay anyone's fears that the imaginary line that separates the countryside from the built-up area was going to start moving west.
Right, and by the way, if you
Nothing
come
we're
back to
talking
the
about.
county study, or the county plan, the county plan was, well, no, the county plan was AT&T,
Right,
and then
The advanced site.
the advanced site. So AT&T
Correct.
coming down to the triangle by Advance and Lamington Road on this side of 206, and that was it. That study did not go to the
West of,
did not go to the west.
Right.
But
Didn't-
when we get into a master plan review, certainly issues down where Anna lives and where Steve lives are fair game for master plan discussions.
Didn't we also talk about the subcommittee made some recommendations that there were certain areas west that were possible targets for increased minimum lot size requirements? We talked about increasing from 10-acre zoning to 20 or 40 in certain areas.
And there's been
So there
some-
might
well, that
be
was
changes.
part of the review committee.
It's part of it,
Yes.
right, part of
But
the
again,
recommendations.
a lot of that is driven more on preservation.
Right.
Yes,
So, I think what Carol's saying, the spirit of what Carol's saying is absolutely right. But we've also found with some of the promotion and discussion of the equestrian industry,
yeah,
that we're getting a little feedback that there might be some land use issues that are precluding those 100-plus acre farms from thriving and from being as valuable on the market as they could be to stay 100-acre farms, to thwart them from being chopped up into
Subdivided.
10-acre zones, 10-acre
Subdivision, yes.
subdivisions.
Uh-huh.
And I think in the big picture, my opinion is that's a good thing. We want to figure out how to keep the big farms big.
True,
And
absolutely.
if there is a tweak in the master plan that says, oh, maybe an accessory dwelling or something for a groom or something like that, that we're not doing right now, that people in Wellington and people in the Hamptons and our competition for those large equestrian owners, yeah, we ought to look at that too. But it's in the spirit of what Carol's saying is, no, we're not moving the commercial corridor west of 206.
Right, we're
And I
not.
think you're 100% right there. And I don't think,
yeah,
I would agree.
maybe I didn't quite say it
No, I-
the way I
yeah.
meant,
Yeah,
but...
and so
but-
the issue is
but-
whether we're talking on this particular topic,
Yes.
or we're talking about the document itself.
Right, I understand.
So,
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think we need to finish this subject, or this document.
Let's remember,
let's put this to bed.
yeah,
Let's put
one
this
thing
to
is,
bed.
if you're ready, and
Yeah.
you could add to it tonight, because remember the rule,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
statute, a re-examination report of a municipal planning board can be changed and adopted at any meeting of the board at any time without a
Right.
master plan hearing, no notice, it's amazing, has a
Right.
significance, and yet can be changed, right? And whereas the master plan is not the
Right.
re-examination report.
Right.
And the master plan is even much bigger than the housing element and fair share plan element, which was 60 pages or whatever it was. So you're going to be getting into looking at the master plan, and you may or may not change that. That master plan is what makes recommendations of significance and of land use elements and designated areas, like where do you recommend changes, that looks a little bit like the ordinance in the land use element, the future land use element, but we're not there yet. We're not even talking, in this document, we're not even talking about the master plan itself and changes to it and its future land use elements, which are, that's the big picture of planning. If you try to think, what do I do as a planning board member that's the most comprehensive, it's amending or adopting the master plan, not the re-examination report. So what we're doing now is we're following up on our prior adoption of the re-examination report from, I think, May or June, and we're trying to make sure we cover all the bases you like to say in the re-examination report, but even putting it here doesn't put it in the master plan.
right. So
Okay?
you're
Correct.
just saying, we've looked at the master plan that we currently have, and here's some, on examination, here's some issues that perhaps we should consider moving forward.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
But that doesn't foreclose you from changing the master plan even
Later.
later, even if you notice to change the master plan and you decide to change the master plan.
I'd like to, this is something that I think is just immensely important. So, and first time Mike going through this with you guys and having any serious dialogue about it. I just want to stay big picture for a little bit, and just bear with me if you would, fellow members. When we talk about the executive summary, we have identified some issues here. And we've talked about it a couple times before at these board meetings, about the fear or the concern that the hills, as a result of perhaps deferred maintenance, et cetera, become something different over the next 10 or 15 years than what it is today or what it was even 10 years ago, and that we may see some sort of erosion in the way the properties are maintained and upkept. So my question there is that we've identified an issue, but we're not necessarily even, hypothesizing about what the solution might be. My question, and I don't know how this gets incorporated, and maybe it doesn't get incorporated here, it's deferred to master planning sessions, is how are the fees that the community associations in the hills, how are the fees that are collected by the community association, how are they spent? I know those types of organizations have broad authority to fine their tenants, owners, et cetera, for not keeping up their property, et cetera. Whereas maybe the municipality doesn't have that same enforcement capabilities. So if those fees
We
are...
have a couple of experts here.
Right, if those fees are being collected, are they being spent? And how do we make sure that the fees that are being collected are spent and poured back into the properties to make sure that they don't fall into disrepair?
Well, we have a huge meeting every 2 months now. Going over the budget, how much to spend on snow removal, how much to repay something. I mean, there's a lot of intense scrutiny.
Take out specimen trees that collapse every snowfall, those kinds of things.
Yeah, or put up fancier flower arrangements around the entranceways, things like that. Now, if someone doesn't pay their monthly fee, now I'm talking about the single-family homes, then all they can do is put a lien on the property. So if one day it sells, then they can collect from profit, any money that's there. Of course, we have someone who's so underwater, who's not doing anything. There's nothing.
Always have the blood out of a rock scenario.
Yeah, Rich, let me go a little
Let
further.
Harold give it from the perspective of the condos.
Well, I will do that because I am the treasurer for both Four Oaks, which is one of the communities, plus our master association. And we have meetings once a month. We go over the budget. We have a new budget, of course, every year, and the members are asked anything that they might want to consider in the next year for budgeting purposes. And we try to stay in that budget every year. We have successfully been able to stay within our budget, except for snow, which is just completely unpredictable. And that's the only thing that we have had to assess for. Now, that doesn't say that for all communities, because that's not true. They assess for a lot of things. And I think the boards I personally feel the boards should be trained. Just like our board is trained, I feel the board members on these associations should be trained as well, because they don't know the rules. They don't know what they should do. And I'll give you an example of one community who took their capital money and used it all for landscaping, and now they have no capital. So when they need a roof, guess what? They've got to assess. Well, and so it can be a problem. How we address it in the master plan or in our documents at all, we can't.
They're independent, private, and not subject to any guidance, restrictions, or
Each
Well, they
community
are.
has
I mean, the
their own bylaws.
DCA, they each have their own
They're
bylaws.
regulated by the DCA.
DCA.
The condominium ones, the
Right.
family is a little
A
special.
little different, they're pretty simple.
How does landscape qualify in Wisconsin?
It's not.
Doesn't, it was a misuse.
It's a misuse of money and funds.
That was a misuse.
You might as well put the money in their pockets.
You might as well.
But
I
by the
mean-
way, the town does have a right to review tree removal,
Yes.
and it might prohibit someone from chopping down.
And
a
capital
tree.
projects, too.
Well, what if you wanted somebody to remove a tree that
Yeah.
is otherwise...
Well, I don't know.
That's the local association's
Well, the association is
responsibility.
an owner, I mean, they'll get fined
All right,
and punished.
I don't want to digress on this
Yeah.
particular issue,
Regulated.
but we've identified this as a potential issue for a while, and I was just wondering if there was someplace in the master plan to kind of either enforce what the goals are, or incentivize in some way, shape, or form, incentivize the community associations to make these repairs?
Oh, they are incentivized. I mean, look, if they don't make the repairs, property values of the community go down and nobody wins. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for
Yeah,
them not to.
But that hasn't kept slums from developing out of nowhere in the past.
Well, I don't think the Hills is in danger of
Right.
turning into a
And-
slum,
Well,
but no,
The one thing that is regulated is condominium associations are regulated by the state of New Jersey Department of Community
yeah.
Affairs, independent of the township. Township is regulated by the Department of Community Affairs, but, so, they are, and they are very special creatures of the state legislature too. So, basically, they operate in that regulatory sphere in which their finances and their budgets and their books are potentially monitored by the DCA for fiscal success and sufficiency of capital and sufficiency of expense. If there was a real problem, theoretically, DCA would order them to do something. That probably doesn't happen too often, and quite frankly, in Bedminster, you have fantastic associations compared to.
Yeah, and Tom, I just want to follow up on that issue. Just, from the town perspective, there's very little to almost nothing that we can do. Those budgets are the association budgets. But just looking back over the last couple of years, all the associations, and even the affordable housing associations, have done a pretty good job of infrastructure improvement, paving, sidewalks, new decks, because as certainly we've heard from Frank and some others, that at 30 years, right? Some of those roofs are beyond their lifespan.
But most of them have been done.
Decking beyond its lifespan, and
Streets?
well, let's call them driveways and parking lots.
Lighting.
But they've been putting money back into that, and I just call it Parkside. All right, so Parkside was facing some stress, and I think in the last 3 years, about 3 years ago, they did a major, I think some of it was special assessments, and they implemented a complete new paving plan. They improved some of the stairs and steps in there. And I think if you look down at the lower hills, you'll see that same element, that the decking has been put in, roofs have been put in, windows have been replaced, and that's association money. So anecdotally, the associations have been taking very good care of what they have.
And they have traditionally done that.
And they traditionally have.
But now there's a lot of big ticket
long-term-
items coming up, as you
Yes.
start to point out. There's a lot of big ticket items coming up, roofs, streets, sidewalks that may be heating in certain locations. I'm not that familiar with the hills as I was
Getting done.
when I was coaching, but yes. So, again, but what I hear you guys tell me is that there's nothing we can do to kind of either create a goal or
Not under our auspices.
No, the only quasi-governmental organization that kind of has some interface with it is BHHC, and that's for the affordable units, the neighborhoods that have the affordable units in it.
And we can,
And
I guess we can issue complaints to the state if we felt like they weren't.
Theoretically could, although it would fall a little bit on deaf ears because the real complainants are the people
Who live in it.
unit owners are the ones that are gonna do that. And who maybe disagree with the association itself. In the case law, it's been made clear that they're associations are almost like private governments.
They're little independent.
They're more than private companies.
They're autonomous in most.
Yeah, and they have much similarity to government, with this exception that they are not public.
Right.
Usually populated by residents who
And they have a bigger-
actually live in the communities that are governed.
I have a bigger stick than I have about my neighbor cutting his grass or taking the 2 trees down.
If the association's being run properly too, a lot of them, especially the ones that Carol and I are involved with, and a few others, is that we are being guided by, in most cases, by professionals too. I mean, we go every 2 or 3 years or 4 years, that we have engineers come in my case, and they study, okay, this roof is gonna fail at this point, this road is gonna have to replace this, and then the money is budgeted for accordingly. So that the money's available, if everything is done properly, when that work is scheduled. So,
Right.
That's
I mean,
right.
I think the concern though is, what if they're not?
Right,
I mean, if there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do.
Right, then you're gonna.
But if everybody's a good actor, then
Mhm.
there's really no use for laws, and clearly we know that.
And hopefully each association has the proper professionals. I mean, that's the other thing that, in our case, we have excellent, credit people so that we don't lose our dues. I mean, they go after them immediately. I mean, and if we can collect it, we do. And of course, the lien put on it immediately. And in a couple of cases, we were actually able to take over the units and rent them. So we were able to collect funds for the association.
The other thing is that actually as a vehicle of dealing with the financial future, True Condominium Association, at least in New Jersey, actually has certain set-asides and resources, reserves for future expected expenses, whereas the homeowners don't.
This is true.
I don't have a reserve for my septic system or a reserve for my roof unless I decide to have one. They're obliged to have reserves. They're obliged to plan for that future expense. And the original financial plan is required to establish that system and to collect small amounts per month over decades to supplement those reserves. We don't have that at all as homeowners, and nobody can tell us we have to.
Right.
And guess what happens? That's when people go into financial distress, right? Or they have to sell.
Governments too.
And governments too.
Right,
So,
exactly.
so it's but as a vehicle for managing the real property, it's pretty impressive how effective it is, and I would say, it's pretty.
If it's got good conscientious people.
Yeah, and you have
Once again, people who live there.
right. But I guess what the concept is, that's something to like. It might mean that there's future governmental cooperation, or it might be that who knows what. I mean, like the BHC sometimes helps out with grants or loans to help people do things to maintain their places or whatever. And they could, if we ever have money, maybe that would happen in the future too. We spent a lot of our housing trust fund monies, and we don't get a lot. But so it's something to be aware of, because you certainly you can't do that much, but it's a concern, right?
But so, and this is something I think that Carol has touched upon before, which is the short-term rental situation, and to the extent to which a short-term rental situation in, let's take your association, so in 4 Oaks, if there's a concern that vacant units are being acquired by investors, absentee investors, or there are folks who have taken jobs somewhere else, they keep it, it's open, they rent it out, and they may rent it out through a program like Airbnb. And they may rent it out to transients who may be coming in working at AT&T for 3 or 4 months and in and out, or they may be renting it for longer than a year. To some extent, that's where the town can get involved on, I believe we have...
you may have some zoning issues.
We have zoning issues associated with short-term
But
rentals.
actually, the deed restriction of the association is even much more enforceable than government.
We have a year
Correct, but
minimum.
in practice, I think the associations are leery of defenses and litigation in enforcing some of those issues.
We have worked on it with our attorney to do what we can to try to enforce that. It's a year, and every year, if you rent your place, you must register it again, and there's a fee, because it takes more management, and the management companies, are looking to get paid for that, because now you become a rental unit versus, a sale. So,
And there's a requirement that if there are rental units, that they be registered
with the town.
with the town as
Right,
well.
right.
And there's also
And we're trying to
requirements with
enforce
fire,
that as well.
with fire safety codes that,
Right.
there should be
Correct.
inspections and
Correct.
should make sure that the detectors are all operable.
Yep.
Whether that happens in practice, whether those registrations are coming in. We know the registrations that do come in, we don't know the
The ones that
registrations
don't.
that don't.
Right, exactly. And we are trying to enforce
And to
that.
Rich's point, and Carl, you've voiced this as well before, if you see more renters coming in, could that signal potential decline of that neighborhood, that association?
Mhm.
Okay, I actually have one question and two possible rhetorical follow-up questions.
You want to explain yourself?
You mean rhetorical, you mean there's no answer to those questions?
Yeah, there might not be. The first is, how many associations are there in the hills that are in Bedminster?
About 20, I
Yeah.
counted.
So there are 20 associations.
Yeah.
The second question is, Township of Bedminster pretty much has no jurisdiction over those 20,
That's basically it, yeah.
those 20 houses?
The jurisdiction is kind of what Larry talked about. They're still subject to zoning, they're still subject to the code enforcement, they're still subject to building code and fire and things of that nature. If they rent, they're still required to register. And there could be generalized ordinances that would regulate everybody, but
So that,
But they're
the
not,
budgets and stuff.
but the budget, the maintenance, the common areas, use and services are all controlled by the homeowners and their associations.
so my second rhetorical question.
Even to the roads. No.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at the master plan and actually setting up a master plan over the next several months, we really don't have to look at or can't look at those 20 associations?
I didn't say that.
I mean,
But
I'm trying to...
you don't, you
we don't-
probably wouldn't because
We have
number-
no jurisdiction.
Here's what the
What is our
master,
responsibility?
well, remember, the master plan is dealing with, although it has different elements, the main part that you concern yourself with for, let's say, future use is the future land use map of the land use element of master plan. And it's a section, and there's a couple of maps, and one is existing land use and one is future land use. And the future land use is what you might say you want Bedminster to look like in these sections of town 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 30 years from now. And that map looks a lot like your zoning ordinance, because if it doesn't, I don't feel real comfortable defending it, okay? But hopefully it does. Does it say it has like the hills and it has all these different zones in the hills? Now, I don't recommend you go tinkering with those, because that means you might allow things that those people that live there don't like, and so you probably won't tinker with those too much. But you could. I'm not aware of anything I would.
You could zone a McDonald's.
Yeah,
on the top of Hills
right,
Drive.
and that may never happen. It may never happen.
And the drive-thru. I drive to McDonald's.
There used to be a McDonald's on Hills Drive.
So your future land development
I know, I'm well
is
aware.
consistent with this ordinance, and the ordinance does have zoning as to that whole thing, that whole area. Many different, I forget, Paul and Frank would know the zones.
One of the things that came up in our subcommittee meeting was that, I think Jeff or Carol mentioned that there's really some issues in the electrical system and the lighting system up in the hills. And at some point, it could become a public safety issue. And maybe even too expensive for the housing associations to pay for. We have no jurisdiction over that? We can't
No,
force them to pay for that, or we can't
Well,
apply
if they
town money
didn't, if
for
they
that?
didn't maintain it, there might be some sort of violation of a code or an electrical code. If it was unsafe, there might be, and that might mean some sort of code enforcement. But we don't, the township has no authority to go self-help and repair private electricity.
We could change the ordinance to like a local law kind of thing, where we said that all electrical wiring needs to be upgraded to, you know,
But that's
14 wire or something like that.
But that has
Because
nothing to
we
do
had a
with the
house
master
fire.
plan or the land use.
No.
Land management. Zero to do with
In the
it.
streets.
Nothing.
In fact, if you put it in the zoning ordinance, it would be grandfathered. The existing would be grandfathered, because remember, zoning is prospective. Zoning
Looking
means
forward.
that These associations are supposed to. Things that exist are allowed to continue to exist
Okay, all right, so I'm
unless
thinking,
destroyed.
this is a complete digression, and I'm sorry, but if the city of New York waited till the gargoyles all fell off the building before they preemptively went in and told people they had to replace the gargoyles with fiberglass ones,
I
a
got
lot more
you.
people would have
I
died.
got you, and those are called code enforcement ordinances. They are
Not
not
master
zoning
plan.
ordinances.
Yeah, master
They're not recommended by the master plan, although they, potentially they could, but they wouldn't, the future land use element in New York City didn't say, adopt a code to make sure the gargoyles don't fall into the street, okay? That came from, guess who? Architects and construction officials in the construction department, and probably the fire department, who had to save somebody, or the ambulance squad that had to help somebody who got hurt. And so they actually put those things into code enforcement, and code enforcement is generally speaking applicable to everyone, not grandfathered, with certain exceptions, like even the building code has grandfathered provisions, and you go into municipal court to seek a violation for not maintaining your roof or your electricity, or you have exposed wires, whatever. But that's not really the master plan, and it's not really the zoning ordinance, okay?
But we could say in the master plan that code enforcement review to upgrade certain aspects of the code
But it wouldn't be.
are necessary.
It wouldn't be, like, the fact that the committee didn't do it wouldn't be even sort of an enforceable recommendation. Even if it was in the zoning, it wouldn't be enforceable, but it would be more meaningful that the ordinance should have been done. If you recommend a zoning ordinance, the committee really ought to try to do it, or have some reasons why they don't do it. So that's all we need. I think if you want to change this re-examination report, we could change it tonight, but I need a majority vote to change something.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. You want to leave it the way it is, and, I mean...
You decide, you...
Yes.
So I just, one of the things I think I mentioned this to Frank is, looking as prospectively, lot coverage, FAR issues, the net habitable FAR issues, to determine whether or not some of the recent changes, and maybe Paul can answer this, have been taken advantage of by the folks who are looking to do those patios and decks and the expansions, looking at some of the recent applications in the residential regarding the habitable floor area issue. Something I think that goes back a few years ago, George, I remember when we talked about this on EC, was shared parking, whether or not there's a way to promote that. Certainly down in Pluckening, you run into some parking issues. There's anything you could do to sort of help alleviate that. So there was just other topics that may warrant consideration as we run through the review.
Well, I agree with you, Larry, and we did have a subcommittee to make quite a few changes for that at the beginning of this year. I don't know if anybody has taken advantage of them, or even if there's been any applications that...
Yes.
There has. Good.
There's probably been, I would say, between 5 and 10 applications this year that have fallen, that have been approvable
Because
under those
of the
standards that
new
otherwise
laws.
would have been.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they would have had to come here,
That you
but they were able to
changed,
just
Right.
pull.
that you already changed in the ordinance
Right.
by your
That's
prior
the
record.
result of your ordinance change.
Right.
That's
That's good.
significant.
Yeah,
That's significant.
So we didn't have to sit that 1 year.
We haven't had 10 applications. We haven't had 10 applications.
So I just like to see what that looks like first before you
Whoa, whoa.
decide that you like
Worked.
it. And then to evaluate that, okay, should that be expanded? Should it apply to other zones? Is it good as it is? And look at, right, so that there's
But
been some
are you
benefit.
ready to say that you want to do any? See, one convenient thing about a reexamination report is it can recommend an ordinance change, even though the master plan doesn't say it. So, but are you at that point? And if you do that, it creates a special category of recommended ordinances. Are you ready? Are there any changes? The thing that I'm counseling you about is, if you really know what you would like to change, it's good to put it in the reexamination report. If you're just saying we want to look at something, you don't even have to say that, because you get to do that in the master plan or at any time.
Well, my concern is that, we had that opportunity, at least my thought was, the way that Frank had prefaced going to the reexamination report, that was a way of looking back at the master plan that you had and going, okay, this is how we changed it 10, 13 years ago. Now, taking a look at, again, this is what we changed way back then, this is what we have today. Anything that we want to throw out there for re-examination and evaluation as we move forward. And so I certainly feel, with George on this, that when the re-examination report came in, we didn't really have the proper time to run through and assess whether that identified the issues that the board would like to see addressed, not necessarily changed, but just examined in a little more detail. So, to me, I'd like to see just, even if it's just putting it down as a checklist, that we come back if and when we run through the master plan review and make those recommendations, that we sort of teed some of them up for discussion. If that's not the purpose of the re-examination report, then I withdraw everything I just said.
No, that can be a purpose, and that can be a worthy venture. The thing that I'm worried about is, do we just want to list it? Don't say anything that would be misinterpreted by someone who wants to take advantage of your intelligent inquiry. That's it.
Oh, you don't have to say that, you just say inquiry.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to put it, is an inquiry. We're not saying we're doing something if we're not doing something. I always think of the unintended consequence.
And the
to it.
unintended consequence is every planning document you have, whether you talk about it or don't talk about it, anything you put in there, when an applicant comes in for a use variance, he's supposed to look at all those planning documents. If you say, we think it's a good idea that you do this, and you haven't completely thought that through, then that can be used to your potential detriment. And that's in part why I would say reference to the county report is important, because if you don't reference it and, assume it doesn't exist, and don't talk about it for or against or at all, or you don't do any analysis of it, then somebody's going to come and say, we want to do this project, and look, it's consistent with this county report. And your master plan, and your re-exam report, and your follow-on planning efforts didn't talk about that report at all. That's why I think you need to consider it, and why you need to include it, because if you ignore it, then it's completely valid. I don't know if that's making any sense to anybody. But that's the way I
But why is it? Why is it, Frank?
Spin on this, Tom.
Frank, why don't the two of you and Frank just sort of think about and sort of verbalize those areas of inquiry that you might want further study, so that he can, shape it into some paragraph that doesn't scare me. Because I'm easily scared, but I don't want to be. So that's just a joke. But basically, think of what do you want to say you want to study, and then how the third party who wants you to change it drastically in their favor views your words. That's sort of the way to think about it when you start saying you want to recommend something. And like a good example is, you looked at FAR, you looked at lot coverage, you looked at some other weird ordinance and changed them, and you didn't need a master plan amendment to do it. You didn't even need a master re-examination report, I don't think, to do it, because you can change things that are not specifically recommended in the master plan pretty much at any time at the township committee level by ordinance, like the percentage of floor area ratio or the percentage of, coverage.
As long as if we change something, this board reviews it and determines it's not inconsistent.
That's right. And many of those things are not in a master plan. The bulk standards and things that, sometimes they're in there, but they're usually not in the master plan. That's the one big difference between the ordinance and the master plan is the master plan is like called the big picture plan, the map, and the ordinance is every single detail of what's allowed in that particular zone. Sometimes some of those standards are in the master plan, and maybe you do have to change the master plan, but Frank would know for sure, but like 10 acres probably is in the R10, and so that's if you were going to change that, but I don't think you do that in a re-examination report, but I think what Larry said was maybe we want to look at lot coverage, floor area ratio, net habitable floor area, and shared parking, and inquire into whether to make changes there. And that, if you were ready to say change, I'd say put it in there. If you wanted to say inquiry.
Well, I think that's what we need to look at if we want to make further changes. I mean, right now, we've made changes, and we haven't had an opportunity to really review that and, think about further changes in the residential area. So,
Yeah, I think part of what Tom's thinking is that if you were to say, for instance, that a pattern of variance requests has indicated that maybe we should give another look to lot coverage or building size or something. Well, if I'm testifying for somebody for a variance, I'm going to pull that out and say, the town already said it looks like we don't give enough coverage. I'm here for more coverage.
So you sort of
trap yourself.
You have to, if you recommend something, go ahead and recommend it.
Yeah.
If you want to study something, say you just want to study it. And maybe we do want to, maybe you are concerned about net habitable floor area. I don't know. I know there are some things you've talked about, you've had some concerns about. So if we're ready to inquire even tonight, we could inquire and make a recommendation.
I don't think I've got any specific language that I would recommend making a change, but when I'm reading through this document, there are several issues that are identified as problematic and not specifically addressed in any particular way. For example, right, and I'm still in the summary, we talked about housing and not necessarily this 24/7, but maybe live, work, play kind of environments. And we've seen a couple of proposals that started and stopped perhaps, but there may be a real need there. And I don't think that and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, because I haven't been a part of a lot of the discussions, but has there been any discussion about changing the uses in some of the zones to accommodate some of these types of residential, whether it's smaller apartments, higher end apartments, in conjunction with some retail, so that we're not looking at a variance for a property that just happens to, look good for 24 to 36 units in a neighborhood that doesn't even begin to suggest 24 to 36 units. But if we want to talk about our growth corridor and do that out on 202, 206, maybe there's an opportunity for us to redefine some of those zones to accommodate some of that kind of multifamily development that we indicate there may be a need for. It may be a reasonable goal, number one. And number two, we all came back from, not all of us maybe, but many of us came back from the meeting down at Bellworks, and that it'd be a great idea to kind of do these redevelopment plans to identify alternate uses for places like not only AT&T, but Purnell and a couple of other sites that we've identified around the township, that, you know, to me, I'd love to see us articulate in plan and rendering. These renderings are so easy to do these days with, you know, computer-generated graphics.
They have architects on it.
Right?
Yeah, right.
But I'd like to see us articulate what we'd like to, not necessarily design it for them in advance and invite people to come and build it, but articulate for them what we'd like to see in the township in these particular
Yes, right.
locations. So
Yeah, I
if
think
we're
we
not
haven't-
saying that in
I
here.
think we haven't got there yet, Rich. That's the
That
next
is-
step.
That is
We-
really, that is what planning is.
Right.
But that's, I mean, I'll defer to Frank, but that's what the master plan and
Right.
amendments to the master plan are best served for, sometimes even, I'm not saying we're gonna do this, redevelopment plans, because
Can we articulate that as a goal even here, though?
if you're ready, but the best, remember what you're saying is, you think there's ways to do it that you might like. When you get to the graphics or to a map designation that's already in this future land use map, you have to amend the master plan to change that. You can't just do that in a reexamination report. So when you get to like, I'd like to do something creative in the, I'm going to just make this one, I'm not saying you're going to do this, because it's in the preservation area, so it drives me crazy, but the Purnell School, you're going to do this at Purnell School. Okay? That's a part of a zone, that's part of the R10 zone. That has the future use map that says that's the large lot zone. And yes, it does allow schools to be in the large lot zone, in the zoning ordinance, but the master plan has that all R10, and Highlands has it all preservation area. And so there's graphics. There's graphics of what would you put it in. There's graphics of what would you want it to look like. That's maybe what the details of the ordinance would be. And generally speaking, that's not a reexamination report, because you do have to do graphics. It's a creation of the
Okay.
I think we should accept the reexamination as we've had it, and I think we've answered the questions for document, and then we will take our next step, which is to get perhaps a subcommittee and start looking at the master plan. I know that Steve was interested in this, and he wanted to do this, and maybe even get it done before he left us. And so I think that's the steps we need to take, instead of keep beating a dead horse here. I think we've talked about it enough, that we all understand it enough, and to do that. Do you agree with that, Frank, that we should, is there any changes more that you see necessary?
I think because we met the statutory requirement with the
Right.
adoption in May, the next time we amend this, we'd probably be a little more thoughtful about what recommendations we are making for change. And in fact, Tom routinely recommends when you have a master plan amendment and a reexamination, that you give the
redo
full
the-
force of the reexamination, the
document.
benefits of being a master plan amendment as well. So I
That
think it'll
makes
get
sense to
tuned
me.
up, but the subcommittee probably will advance those concepts over the next several months so that the board talks about what options there might be. Will it be continuing the subcommittee we had, or?
Well,
Do you
what I was
anticipate?
thinking perhaps is that we did have a subcommittee for the residential, and maybe that subcommittee would like to re-look at what has happened, see how it's affected the applications that came in, and then we could take another subcommittee and look at the commercial part of it, look at the villages and perhaps the AT&T part of it. Does that make sense to do it that way?
Carol, when you said you had a residential subcommittee, I didn't remember that. Was that the work on the
Well, Lou was on it.
the ordinance, the
Yeah,
floor area, and things
Yeah.
like that? Okay, but,
Myself and Kathy and Doug.
Yeah.
yeah. You know, I think maybe just a master plan subcommittee of, because you might want to talk about mixed use, you might want to talk about
Right, understand
how
that.
to change,
Uh-huh.
if anything, in in the residential zones, and then how to change things in the, I would rather
We could
call it the
certainly do
villages.
that.
I'd rather you call things Bedminster Village and Pluckerman Village and the area, rather than the word corridor. I really don't think we should ever use the word corridor.
Okay. All
Anymore.
right.
So, especially not in our master plan. So, because
Okay.
corridor planning is not planning.
Okay.
And so we're going to be planners, and we're going to say we have 2 villages, and how do we deal with those villages? How do we deal with our environs for
Okay, we'll do
those
it
Highlands
that way.
lovers, okay? And how do we deal with the preservation area? So,
What's the maximum?
so a master plan subcommittee would
Subcommittee,
be
okay.
really a
We'll do it
good
that
one,
way.
you know, is just like 4 of the 9, and you get into everything at your subcommittee, and then you
We can take
report back
Bob's
to us.
report
You can take
and
Bob's-
really
Whatever you want it to, yeah.
Take
Take
it
it apart. Take
and
it apart.
say, here's what we like, here's what we don't.
Okay, that's
And-
certainly
and
a way to do it.
Since there'd be 4 of us on this committee, that would at least give it some juice going forward. Doesn't give us the
Okay.
majority, but it gets some, sense of support for it.
Steve, are you up for this?
Till December.
Okay. Well, you're very familiar with it, I know you are, so.
Now, you can't even have an ex officio member. You have 4 of 9.
Okay.
Yeah, so like, somebody else can just stop in. That's violation of Open Public Meetings Act.
Yeah,
So it's
I
going to be
understand.
4 people max
Okay.
ever, okay?
All right, I certainly would like to be on it.
But Steve,
How about Rich?
Steve could still
Since you
come.
seem to have a passion towards
I
putting.
have-
You got graphics in your
I
mind.
do have a passion for this.
Okay.
Well, but
all right.
Watch out, if he puts together a land use board softball team,
Okay,
Well, then we'll do a notice.
all right, so we need one more. Who would, Lou, you want to continue on? Okay.
Why don't you let me do it? Who did the residential?
Okay,
Okay,
you want to do it? Do it.
if you want to, sure. We're-
I think that's only fair.
Well, I'm asking for volunteers, I'm not picking and choosing. You're more than welcome, of course.
Okay, there you
All
go.
right, okay, so it's Steve, George, myself, and Rich, how's that? Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, that's
Thank
a diversity from what we've had in the past, so that's good. Okay, so we'll start on that, and I think we should start in September. Let's let August in the summer go past, and we'll start in September, and we'll try to whip it together there. Not to the point where we exclude anything, but try to work diligently at it, okay?
And I know this is frustrating and a lot of work, but I think your master plan is online, isn't it, Frank?
Yep.
You know, you have a great master plan, one of the best in the state.
Mm-hmm.
Get a little familiar with it, but specifically look at the future land use element and the land use element and the future land use maps. And just, that's your first graphic to be thinking about and focusing in on. And then, I'm not a big believer in redoing a whole master plan because that costs a lot of money. And I don't know that we have a lot of money, but you don't need a lot of money to do an amendment to a master plan. So if you, as a subcommittee, think of things that you think should be changed, and it doesn't mean redoing the whole master plan because you like certain parts of the master plan, that's okay. It's, people criticize incremental thinking and incremental planning, but we all think incrementally. We don't change things that we like, right? If we like something, we want it to remain the way it is. So the things that you want to change are the things you are hoping for change about, and that's increment. That's looking at an area. That's looking at a district or some standard even. And it sounds myopic or something, but it's not. That's the way human beings plan.
Now, I will say, as I looked towards this a couple years ago, the intention was never to throw the old master plan out and redo it. It's tweaking. It's tweaking.
Yeah.
And recognizing how some things have changed and that some things do need to be addressed. But boy, there's an awful lot to like and probably very little to change.
There's
But the stuff that needs to be-
both challenges.
But the stuff that needs to be changed needs to be done.
Well,
Otherwise,
because
it's going to happen and we'll be reacting to it.
Yep.
Right, and then...
I mean, there's technology that's changed,
Right,
and just the
right.
way the use has changed. I mean, look at the offices, the way they've changed.
Yeah, isn't
today.
that amazing?
It's it's much different than it
And with
was
the-
when we
those-
came into existence 20, 30 years ago. So, okay.
I just have a
Yeah, go
comment.
ahead.
I think it might be helpful if we brought in someone from the Board of Education to do a presentation for us, or for us to ask questions about what might we do to improve the master plan or tweak it for the educational part of the community.
I think we'll have that discussion.
Yeah,
I think we'll definitely talk to the Board of Ed and make sure. Bob gave them an option, but
Yeah.
we will definitely readdress it.
Right. And
Larry and I sit as the liaisons to the board. We'll make sure that they get a voice in this.
Can we bring someone from the board here in front of the board, in front of our board, to ask questions, or is this only for something for the subcommittee to do?
I suppose we can ask. Let me address that with them offline, because sometimes they're really interested and sometimes they got too many alligators they're beating and they just assume.
I discussed it a little bit.
I love that game.
Beating alligators.
The reason I say this is because we're talking about, apartments and condo development, all these other things. We should get the input from the school system about what their needs might be in the future and so forth. And then the other thing is I have a contact in the equestrian community that might be willing to talk to us, again, the board or a committee, to give us a long history of how the equestrian community has changed in Bedminster over the last 30 years or so. So that might be another option, since I'm not on the committee at this point, bringing someone in, and I may be able to make that contact. Someone who understands the trail systems, understands everything there is about Bedminster historically in terms of the equestrian community. So that might be someone who might be interested in questions and answers too.
Okay. I bet George might know somebody like that.
Yeah, or George.
A neighbor or two.
That might be particularly good for a subcommittee to have a conversation about, because remember our discussion last month or the month before about how the equestrian community its history is much of a private rights sharing, but not guaranteeing or dedicating.
Right.
And so how, again, because government cooperatively work with people that want to cooperate but not grant. Okay, and that's very special and very unique. So you might not, it might be easier discussed first as a subcommittee and then with some ideas to the full board and then maybe to the committee.
We'll certainly look at that. I mean, it's part of us. So we'll look at it, definitely. Okay, I think we need to move on. Let's talk about the stormwater training that we all did, right?
Which
Online?
I'm sure was fascinating. But to paraphrase Larry, it was at the same time both too simplistic and too complex. And I agree with that.
Yeah.
And that's a very good appraisal to do it. And I've seen that in a lot of the DEP training programs. And we all know that rain falls and runs off. Kind of know that.
And water runs downhill.
And just so you don't think the DEP has particular contempt for board members, I was at a 2-day class for engineers whose job it is to review these things, and they got a room full of professional engineers, and the first half a day was that water comes down from clouds and hits the rain and runs off. So, I think...
They bore you to death.
Yeah, it was a snoozer, but I think that, I probably find the information in that training more interesting than most of you might. But I think my takeaway from it was, I hope it gave you some ideas as to what the purpose of stormwater management is, how it's evolved over time, and really what we look at on every one of these applications. You see these books come in this thick, and it's to address all that. And I have one guy in my office and he lives in those books, and I feel for him, but he actually is very good at it. So I don't know if you have any particular questions or you want me to expand on anything in that training or what, but I think it's a good thing to get that information out there. I think one thing that is missing from most of what the DEP puts out is there is a concept called engineering judgment. And everything's not absolute. They say in these calculations, you can't exceed X percent of something. All right, what does it mean to exceed that? How many decimal places are we talking about? When these models are based on very gross analysis and, aren't intended to be accurate to that many decimal places, the calculations come out to 6 decimal places. And as Nick can probably tell all of you, you are beyond the significant digits, and it doesn't make any sense. And I say that as someone who's been hung up by review engineers on the 100th of a cubic foot per second. And it's just a meaningless figure.
Well, all I can say as a board member, that's why we have an engineer.
From the program, I learned that I know enough to know what I don't know and defer to the expert.
Exactly.
I learned how bad lawns are.
Yeah, and here's the interesting thing. If people say there can't be any increase in runoff from your property.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept, but if you cut the grass, it's got more runoff than before you cut the grass.
Right.
So, absolutes are always wrong.
So one of the questions, and I think Paul, you and I have discussed this in with regard to certain applications, is Bedminster soil is a bit special compared to the rest of the
If you ever
state.
tried to dig a post hole, no.
Is there a provision or allowance that we should be mindful of here in Bedminster? And by the way, certainly even within the town, where Steve lives is different soil than where Kathy lives, or where George lives,
Or the hills.
Where Anna lives, or the hills. Yeah. So the soil's different, right?
Yes.
So if you take this presumption that the dirt or undeveloped land doesn't have runoff or has minimal runoff here in Bedminster, that's not necessarily the case.
And that is accounted for in the hydrologic soils groups, which I think was touched on in that report. And they are, again, gross classifications of A, B, C, and D as to a measurement of how much infiltration, therefore inversely runoff, different types of soils have. Bedminster soils tend to be C soils. That means they have more runoff. Okay, that's what they are. Now, there's no such thing as a C plus or C minus. There's C soils. It's a fairly gross assumption. Now, one of the issues you have, and this is always a challenge, is if you say there's no recharge in Bedminster soils and everything runs off. And that means under the existing condition, everything runs off and there's no recharge. So under the proposed conditions, everything can run off and there's no recharge, which is not necessarily the result that you want, which is why I think it's a good idea that these hydrologic soils groups are relatively broad, because Bedminster soils are not great for infiltration, particularly at the surface. But if it weren't better down below, there would be no passing septic systems in the township. You get down into the more fractured soil, and you do get some recharge. That's why your wells work. Okay, so there is some of that, but what happens is in these soils, the very top surface, you get the classic Bedminster red clay, and that's just like a brick, and water does not move through that very easily. So that's all part of the model, and that's what we do look at. Bedminster soils are different, are mostly B, as I said, C soils. Some areas might be B. D soils generally are wetland areas where they're already saturated. A soils are sand.
Is testing done on a per application basis for new construction?
No, well, the answer is yes and no. There are testing procedures to reclassify a hydrologic soils group. Say somebody wanted to say, I'm really a C soil, not a B soil, because I have more runoff under my existing condition. I don't want my detention basin to be as large, even though the mapping says it's a B soil. There are provisions in the best management practices, PMP manual, that say this is how you have to test to demonstrate and reclassify your soil from one group to another.
Okay, so if you want it reclassified, you actually have to pay for that test to be done?
There is a lot of testing that needs to be done, and there's provision as to how many per acre that need to be done, and it just goes on. And there is also site-specific testing that's required for any infiltration or recharge systems. That has to be done as part of the design process.
Thank you.
So if you're doing a recharge system, are you testing the perk rate at surface, or are you testing it at depth?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
My mistake for phrasing the question like that.
And the answer is generally it is both. What sometimes I've seen is they'll test the very shallow layers and say, I don't have any recharge, so I don't have to do any later. I'm very skeptical about that, and always make them test lower and have them do some recharge, because there always is some recharge of some extent.
What is an example? Is there an example of a rain garden that we would all be familiar with here in town?
No, not that I can think of. Rain gardens are wonderful thoughts, but as effective BMPs, they're not. They're very small. They only work at very small scale project. They tend only to work where you have very good recharge at the shallow surface. Otherwise, they stay wet and everything in it dies, and you have a swamp and mosquitoes. So they're
So that was one of the takeaways from the DEP presentation, was like, oh, you should be pushing this, you guys should be pushing rain gardens.
Yeah, well, no, because they don't work on a large scale. What can work on a larger scale, what is a good semi-non-structural strategy, are bioswales, bioretention bases, which are larger scale rain gardens. To me, a rain garden is something, 3 times as big as this table, that's behind a house, which is wonderful, and it has certain good aspects to it, but what does it really do? Once it fills up,
What does Willow have? Do they have
Willow has constructed wetland detention basins. All theirs were designed before the new rules came out.
Right.
And they basically are ahead of the curve on that. They did what the new rules want you to do.
And just anecdotally, how's that working up there?
Well, it's working well.
Paul, is the reason why a gravel road is considered coverage in Bedminster a function of the soil here?
No.
In other jurisdictions, gravel is not considered.
Well, you're getting into a couple different things here. The ordinance regulates lot coverage. Lot coverage is not necessarily impervious coverage. Lot coverage under our ordinance is a coverage that reduces the permeability of the soil versus a vegetated cover. Okay, so yes, a gravel driveway is considered lot coverage. Now, when I review somebody's lot grading plan that comes in, and they have a gravel driveway, I require that they design it as if it's paved. Because what's to stop that person from paving it in the future? They can do that without a permit. So I either require them to design it as if it's impervious, as if it's paved, or I tell them they have to put a deed restriction on the property. That usually makes them design it as if it's paved. Otherwise, we have no control. Somebody in the R10 zone paves a half-mile long driveway, 2 years after they said they weren't going to pave it.
But there's all kinds of options that designers come up with, whether it's, porous asphalt, whether it's concrete mats that grass grows through, that's only 50%, solid, all these kinds of.
Yes, but under the DEP regulations, it has to be 60% permeable, not to be considered impervious.
60%.
60%. So all those concrete block paving systems won't qualify. Obviously, porous asphalt or porous concrete will not qualify. Now, they have value as it relates to water quality, but they don't really address the runoff.
And they don't provide any relief if you're.
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions for storm water management? Okay, I think that's good, and I hope everybody looked at their...
I would like to note that I sat through Frank's, and he walked out on mine.
And Tom, you're down to 10 seconds to slide.
Oh, and look at who came back. Timing is
All
extraordinary.
right.
Counting the cold.
He gave him 15 in the beginning.
You don't know what we have to do.
Trying to walk off his pneumonia.
We have any other business that we have to do in open session, because I'd like to have a closed session about the insurance advice and the course that I have to give you about municipal officials' liability. It's a legal issue. So,
Yeah, no, I don't
I think
we
the
have
only thing was
yeah.
Remington Farms, Fiddler's Elbow, and we talked about that for 6
Right, we did, right. And does the board have
So
any
we are
other?
going to cancel both August meetings then?
We'll cancel
Okay.
both August meetings then, and we'll
next
meet in
meeting will be
September.
September
6th at 7 p.m. And I'm recommending to the board that you adopt a motion on a resolution to go into closed or executive session pursuant to section 7 and 8 of the Open Public Meetings Act to discuss matters of attorney-client privilege communications, the matters to be revealed in public upon the completion of all litigation and appeals, and the removal of the need for confidentiality. Is there such a motion on such a resolution?
So moved.
Second.
And a roll call, please.
Mayor Barker?
Aye.
Mr. Jacobs?
Aye.
Mr. Stracco?
Aye.
Ms. Christie?
Aye.
Mr. Adulias?
Aye.
Mr. Leonard? Mr. D?
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik?
Aye.
Mr. Travaglini?
Aye.
Ms. Patras?
Aye.
And Ms. Gutschall.
Aye.
And if you want to get this, yeah, look like it.
Frank, you want
Kind
to
of
take care
natural
of the door
death.
in the back? Take care of that, oh.
Everybody stay, because we gotta have you sign that you're at this course. And I have to certify it and email me. Everything's gotta be perfect. So,
Yeah, and we have.
And right now it's
I have to
locked
send it
down.
back to
Nobody's
Chip,
allowed
so-
out.
and this is very important to you too, because as Trina reminded me, and at the end of the outline, they explained that you have $50,000 of individual liability insurance
Yeah.
that only accrues to you if needed for some very extreme situations like criminal acts and
Video's off now? Video's off?
No.
you only benefit by it as individuals if you take this course and certify you took it, and I sign the certification. So,
You have to sign certification?
yeah.